My sister rolled her eyes and whispered, "Don't let Ethan talk. He'll embarrass the family again." 10 minutes later, I stood up in front of the board and showed them exactly who had been destroying the company. And IT wasn't me. The look on her face when her favorite brother lost everything was priceless. I'm 27 years old now, and for as long as I can remember, I felt like the extra piece of my own family. The part that was never supposed to be included in the set. I grew up in a wealthy Midwestern family, where everything always looked polished from the outside. My father owned a large manufacturing company called Caldwell Fabrication Group, the kind of business that employed hundreds of people and sponsored half the town's events. And my mother built her entire identity around maintaining the image of a perfect, successful family. From the outside, we looked like the kind of household people admired. Inside the house, though, everyone seemed to have a role already assigned, and mine was the one nobody really needed. My older brother Brandon was 5 years older than me, and was basically raised as the future of the family from the moment he could walk. Growing up, he was a definition of what my parents considered success. He was a star athlete in high school, the kind of guy teachers praise and coaches brag about. He got straight into a good business school, earned his MBA, and by his late 20s, he was already working directly under my father at Caldwell Fabrication Group. Every conversation about the future of the company somehow circled back to Brandon. My father spoke about him with this kind of proud certainty, like the entire legacy of the family was safely secured because Brandon existed. My sister Madison was 2 years younger than Brandon and had a completely different kind of spotlight, but she still lived right in the center of it. She built this glamorous online lifestyle brand that my parents absolutely adored. She posted about travel, fashion, fitness, and curated versions of her life that made everything look perfect. My mother especially loved talking about Madison's social media presence, as if it were some kind of major business empire. At family dinners, she would bring up Madison's follower counts, brand deals, or photo shoots the way some parents talk about their kids becoming doctors or lawyers. Then there was me. I was the third child, 5 years younger than Madison, and apparently the one nobody planned for. I didn't learn that directly from my parents at first. I learned it from whispers, from overheard conversations between relatives, from those moments when adults think kids aren't paying attention. I remember hearing things like how finances were tight when I was born, or how my parents thought they were finished having children before I showed up. Nobody said it directly to my face when I was little, but the message always found its way to me. As I got older, the comments became less subtle. Sometimes they came disguised as jokes during family gatherings. Someone would laugh about how Brandon and Madison were the originals, and I was the bonus round. Other times relatives would talk about how my parents already had the perfect son and daughter before I came along. People always laugh when they said things like that, as if it was harmless. But when you grow up hearing those things again and again, you start to internalize them. I learned pretty quickly that I wasn't going to win the same kind of attention my siblings got. Brandon had the company waiting for him. Madison had the spotlight and admiration. So my strategy became something very simple. Stay quiet, stay out of trouble, and try to be the easiest kid to deal with. I worked hard in school because it was one of the few things I could control. I stayed out of drama, didn't get into trouble, didn't party much, didn't argue with my parents. I figured that if I caused zero problems, maybe eventually they would look at me and see someone worth respecting. But family gatherings always reminded me exactly where I stood. At holidays or birthday dinners, the comparisons would start almost automatically. Someone would ask Brandon about the company, and my father would proudly explain the projects they were working on together. Madison would show everyone pictures from some photo shoot or brand event, and my mother would beam like she was presenting a trophy. When the conversation turned to me, the tone usually shifted into something lighter, almost like people were preparing for a punchline. Sometimes it was little comments about how quiet I was. Sometimes someone would joke that I was the low-maintenance one. Other times they would compare us directly in ways that were clearly meant to be playful, but never felt that way to me. Brandon was the ambitious one. Madison was the glamorous one. And I was just Ethan, the one who didn't quite measure up to the golden children. I learned to smile through it. I learned to nod and laugh along with everyone else, even when it felt like every comment was another reminder that I wasn't really part of the same story as the rest of them. Over time, that role became so normal that nobody even questioned it anymore, including me. It was just a place I occupied in the family structure, the unexpected third child who existed quietly on the edge while everyone else stood in the center. About 6 months before everything finally fell apart, my mother decided it would be a wonderful idea to organize a massive extended family reunion at a mountain lodge in North Carolina. It was the kind of place that looked like it belonged in a luxury travel magazine, a huge wooden building surrounded by tall trees and open land, with a massive stone fireplace in the main hall, and a wide deck overlooking the mountains. My mother had spent months planning the entire event and kept talking about how important it was for the whole family to reconnect and celebrate being together. According to her, more than 50 relatives were coming, including cousins I hadn't seen in years, uncles and aunts from different states, and even distant relatives whose names I barely remembered. When I finally drove up to the lodge parking lot that first afternoon, the feeling of being out of place hit me before I even stepped out of my car. My old used sedan looked painfully out of place between the rest of the vehicles already parked there. Brandon had arrived earlier in his brand new luxury SUV, the kind of vehicle that looked like it belonged to the CEO, and Madison's sleek electric sports car was parked a few spaces away, shining like it just rolled out of a showroom. My car was a decade old, slightly scratched on the side door, and suddenly it felt like the perfect visual summary of my role in the family. Still, I told myself the same thing I always told myself before family events. Just keep your head down, be helpful, and don't give anyone a reason to criticize you. The lodge was already buzzing with activity when I walked inside. Relatives were hugging each other, laughing loudly, catching up on years of stories and life updates. My mother was moving the crowd like a host at a major event, greeting people and making sure everything looked perfect. Brandon was already deep in conversation with several uncles about business and investments, while Madison was showing a group of cousins photos from her latest brand campaign on her phone. I slipped into the background almost automatically. Over the course of that weekend, I did what I always did at family gatherings. I made myself useful. On the first evening, I helped carry boxes of food supplies from the kitchen to the outdoor area. The next morning, I woke up early and helped set up tables and chairs on the lawn behind the lodge. During the afternoon cookouts, I spent most of my time standing behind the grill flipping burgers and hot dogs while other people relaxed with drinks and conversations. Whenever younger cousins started getting bored, I was the one who took them to play games or run around outside. When meals ended and people drifted away to socialize, I stayed behind to help clean up plates, trash, and leftover food. None of it was asked of me directly. It was just a role I naturally stepped into. By the second night, the reunion had reached its biggest event of the weekend. My mother had planned a large outdoor dinner under string lights that were hung between tall wooden posts around the lawn. Long tables were arranged across the grass, covered with white cloths and decorated with candles and small flower arrangements. The air was warm, the mountains were dark silhouettes in the distance, and the whole scene looked like something out of a wedding reception. Everyone had food and drinks. Conversations were loud and overlapping, and I remember thinking that maybe this weekend was actually going better than usual. I had managed to stay mostly invisible, while still being helpful, which for me was usually the best possible outcome. Then my father stood up. He had been drinking throughout the evening. Not in an angry way, but in the relaxed, loud way he tended to get during celebrations. Someone handed him a glass, and he tapped it lightly with a fork to get everyone's attention. The noise around the table slowly quieted down as people turned toward him. My first thought was that he was about to give one of those sentimental speeches people make at family gatherings, something about how important family is and how lucky we all were to be together. Phones started coming out almost immediately. Madison pulled out her phone to record. A couple of my cousins lifted their cameras. My mother stood next to my father, smiling proudly, as if she had been waiting for this moment all evening. My father began talking about the family history, about how proud he was of everyone, about how rare it was for so many relatives to gather in one place. People nodded and smiled while he spoke. The whole thing felt exactly like the kind of speech I expected. Then he looked directly at me. He raised his hand and motioned for me to come over. At first, I thought he just wanted me closer, so I could be included in the moment somehow. I walked over slowly, feeling dozens of eyes following me as I stepped away from my seat and toward him. As soon as I reached him, he threw an arm loosely around my shoulders and laughed loudly. And then he said it. He announced to everyone, in a joking tone that carried across the entire lawn, that I was a surprise accident that somehow turned out okay. The words hit me like a physical blow, but before I could even process them, the reaction from the crowd started. Some relatives laughed immediately, the kind of loud laugh that people give when they think they are supposed to find something funny. Others laughed more awkwardly, glancing around as if trying to figure out whether this was actually an acceptable joke. I could hear someone clap. A few people repeated the word accident under their breath with amused smiles. My father squeezed my shoulder and kept talking, clearly enjoying the attention. He said that every family had one mistake they ended up keeping, and then he gestured toward me again and called me the family mistake we kept. More laughter followed. I stood there in front of more than 50 relatives while cameras were still pointed in our direction, feeling my face burn with humiliation as the sound of laughter spread across the tables. Some people looked uncomfortable, but most were smiling, and the moment stretched on long enough that it became painfully clear that this wasn't just an offhand comment. To them, it was a joke. To me, it was every quiet whisper I had ever heard growing up, suddenly spoken out loud in front of everyone. For a few seconds after my father finished his joke, I just stood there beside him while the laughter rolled across the lawn. The string lights above us cast this warm glow over everyone's faces, and what I remember most clearly is how normal everything looked. People were smiling. Some were still holding their drinks. A few cousins were leaning toward each other while laughing, and several phones were still pointed in my direction, recording the moment. The entire scene looked like a happy family gathering, except I was standing there feeling like someone had just stripped away whatever illusion I had been holding on to for years. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I didn't try to defend myself or confront my father. In that moment, something inside me simply went quiet. I stepped out from under my father's arm and took a few steps backward away from the center of attention. My father had already turned back toward the tables, still smiling and enjoying the reaction from crowd. People were talking again. Laughter was fading into normal conversation, and plates and glasses were clinking against the tables like nothing unusual had happened. I stood there for another moment, just long enough to realize something that felt strangely calm and final. No one was coming after me. No one was asking if I was okay. No one even seemed to notice that I was slowly stepping away from the gathering. The spotlight had already moved on, and the night was continuing exactly as it had before. So I turned around and walked back toward the lodge. The path from the lawn to the building was lit by small ground lights, and I could still hear the distant sound of voices and music behind me as I walked. With every step, the noise grew quieter until it was just a faint background sound. When I opened the back door of the lodge and stepped inside, the sudden silence of the hallway felt almost surreal compared to the noise outside. I walked upstairs to the guest room I had been assigned for the weekend and closed the door behind me. For the first time that night, I sat down on the edge of the bed and just stared at the floor. What surprised me most was that I didn't feel shocked anymore. I didn't even feel angry yet. What I felt instead was a kind of clarity that I had never allowed myself to fully accept before. My father's speech hadn't been a random drunken joke. It was the truth. Not the truth about whether I was an accident or not, but the truth about how they actually saw me. The laughter, the casual way everyone reacted, the fact that no one thought I'd cross a line, all of it made something painfully obvious. This wasn't misunderstanding or a bad moment. It was a natural outcome of years of small comments, comparisons, and jokes that I had tried to ignore. Sitting there in that quiet room, memories started resurfacing one after another like they had been waiting for this exact moment. I remember being a kid and overhearing my parents arguing about money shortly after I was born, hearing my mother say that things had been easier before they had another child to support. I remembered family dinners where Brandon's achievements were celebrated while I quietly ate my food and listened. I remembered Madison teasing me in front of relatives, and everyone laughing while I tried to pretend it didn't bother me. I remembered the few times I actually tried to speak up. Whenever I told my parents that certain jokes bothered me, or that I didn't like constantly being compared to Brandon, the conversation always ended the same way. They would look at me like I was overreacting and say I was too sensitive. My father would tell me I needed thicker skin. My mother would say I should learn to take a joke. Eventually, I stopped saying anything at all. And now, after standing in front of 50 relatives while my father proudly called me the family mistake they kept, I finally understood something I had spent years trying not to admit. Nothing was ever going to change. I sat in that room for a long time before I moved again. When I finally stood up, it wasn't because I had decided to confront anyone or explain how I felt. It was because a simple decision had formed in my mind with a level of certainty I had never experienced before. I was done. I pulled my small travel bag out from the corner of the room and started packing the few things I had brought for the weekend. I didn't take long because there wasn't much to pack. A couple of shirts, a pair of jeans, my laptop, my wallet, and my keys. I moved quietly through the room, folding things and placing in the bag while the distant sound of reunion continued outside. At one point, I paused and looked at my phone. Messages from family members were already appearing in the group chat, where people were sharing photos and videos from the night. Someone had posted a clip of my father's speech with laughing emojis. I stared at the screen for a few seconds before powering the phone off completely. I didn't leave a note. I didn't say goodbye to anyone. I simply picked up my bag, walked down the stairs, and slipped out to the same back door I had entered earlier. The parking lot was quiet when I reached it. Most of the cars were still there, including Brandon's expensive SUV and Madison's shiny electric sports car. My old sedan sat exactly where I had left it earlier that day. I placed my bag in the passenger seat, started the engine, and drove away from the lodge. At first, I didn't have any kind of plan. I just followed the dark highway away from the mountains, letting the road stretch out in front of me while the lodge disappeared behind me. I drove through the night with my phone turned off and the radio playing quietly in the background. Hours passed like that. Sometime around sunrise, I crossed another state line, and then another after that. The sky slowly turned from dark blue to pale orange while the road kept moving forward under my tires. With every mile that passed, the distance between me and my family grew larger, and instead of feeling scared, I felt something I hadn't expected. Relief. Over the next few days, I kept driving west until I eventually reached Seattle, Washington. It was far enough away that nobody from my family would ever casually pass through the city or expect to find me there. It was a place where my last name didn't mean anything, and where nobody knew the role I had played in my old life. Once I arrived, I made the separation complete. I changed my phone number. I ignored the flood of emails that eventually started appearing once I turned my laptop back on. I deleted every social media account I'd ever used, so there would be no easy way to track me. And then, quietly and deliberately, I started building an entirely new life that had nothing to do with the family I had left behind. The first few months after I arrived in Seattle felt strangely quiet, but not in a lonely way. It was the kind of quiet that comes when your life is no longer constantly shaped by other people's expectations. For the first time since I was a kid, no one around me knew my last name or had any assumptions about who I was supposed to be. I was just another person in a large city, another face walking through crowded streets or sitting in coffee shops with a laptop. That anonymity gave me a sense of freedom I had never experienced before. At the beginning, I kept my life extremely simple. I rented a small apartment that overlooked a narrow street lined with old brick buildings and trees that seemed permanently damp from the Seattle rain. The place wasn't impressive, but it was quiet and it was mine. No family portraits on the walls. No conversations about legacy or expectations. No comparisons to anyone else. Just a space where I could exist without constantly feeling evaluated. I had always enjoyed photography as a hobby when I was younger, something I used to escape from the tension of family life. And once I settled in the city, I decided to see if I could turn that interest into actual work. At first, it was slow and uncertain. I started by taking small freelance jobs, photographing local events, small businesses, and occasionally doing portraits for people who found me through community boards or local listings. The pay wasn't huge, but each project led to another connection or recommendation, and gradually the work became more consistent. What surprised me most about building that career was how satisfying it felt to grow something entirely on my own terms. Nobody was comparing my progress to Brandon's business achievements or Madison's social media success. If a client liked my work, it was because of what I created, not because of my last name or some expectation attached to it. Over time, I started spending more time at a local creative co-working space not far from my apartment. It was an old converted warehouse filled with long shared tables, glass meeting rooms, and walls covered in artwork created by the people who worked there. The place was full of freelancers, designers, small startup founders, and artists of all kinds. The atmosphere was collaborative and relaxed, the opposite of the rigid professional environments I had grown up seeing around my father's company. People there talked about ideas instead of status. Conversations revolved around creative projects, software tools, photography techniques, design concepts, and startup experiments. Nobody asked about family background or social standing. The only thing that mattered was what you were currently building. That co-working space was where I met Hannah Brooks. Hannah was a UX designer who worked with several small tech startups, and she had a calm, thoughtful way of speaking that made people feel comfortable almost immediately. The first time we talked was over coffee in the shared kitchen area after she noticed the photos I was editing on my laptop. She asked about the camera I was using and the lighting setup I preferred for portraits, and within a few minutes of conversation had turned into an easy discussion about creativity, storytelling, and the strange ways people present themselves in images. What stood out about Hannah wasn't just her intelligence or her curiosity, although she had plenty of both. It was the way she listened. When I spoke, she paid attention in a way that felt genuine rather than polite. There was no subtle evaluation behind her questions, no comparison to someone else, no hidden expectation that I needed to live up to some predetermined role. Over the next several months, we became close friends. We worked at the same co-working space several days a week, often grabbing lunch together or walking through nearby parks when we needed a break from our screens. Eventually, the conversation shifted toward personal histories, and at some point I told her about the family I had left behind. I expected the same reactions I had seen before when people heard pieces of my story, the kind of polite discomfort that suggested they didn't quite believe it or didn't know how to respond. Instead, Hannah reacted with a kind of quiet understanding that made the conversation feel safe rather than awkward. She didn't minimize what I described, and she didn't try to turn it into a dramatic story either. She simply acknowledged that families can sometimes build roles that trap people in ways they don't even realize. One afternoon, while we were talking about those experiences, Hannah suggested something that changed the direction of my life in a way I never expected. She told me that the way I described my past sounded like something many people could probably relate to, especially the feeling of being treated as the scapegoat in a family where certain children were idealized while others were quietly blamed for everything that went wrong. She suggested that maybe I should try writing about it, not as a complaint, but as a reflection on what it feels like to grow up in that kind of environment. At first, the idea felt strange to me. I had spent most of my life avoiding attention, not seeking it. But Hannah kept encouraging me, explaining that writing about personal experiences can help other people understand their own situations. Eventually, I decided to try it. I created a small blog and gave it the name Second Chance Stories. I wrote under a pseudonym because I still didn't want my family name connected to anything I was doing. The first few posts were simple reflections about growing up in a household where one child was always compared to others, where jokes and small comments slowly shaped a person's identity over time. Writing those posts turned out to be unexpectedly therapeutic. Putting those memories into words helped me understand them in ways I hadn't before. Instead of feeling like a collection of random humiliations or misunderstandings, my childhood started to look like a pattern that had shaped the role I played in the family. Then one evening I wrote a longer post about the moment when someone finally realizes they have been assigned the role of the family scapegoat. I described the gradual process of noticing how blame and criticism seem to land on the same person again and again, how jokes slowly reveal deeper beliefs, and how difficult it can be to accept that the people closest to you may never see you the way you hoped they would. I posted it without expecting much reaction. Within a few days, that post started spreading far beyond the small circle of readers I had originally imagined. People began sharing it across different platforms and forums, and the comments filled with messages from readers who said the story felt painfully familiar to their own experiences. Thousands of people read it. Many of them wrote about how they had spent years feeling like the odd one out in their own families, without having a language to describe what was happening. Others talked about the relief of finally recognizing that the role they had been given was not a reflection of their actual worth. For the first time in my life, people were paying attention to something I created not because they were mocking me or comparing me to someone else, but because they genuinely connected with what I had to say. And for the first time, I felt valued not for fitting into a role my family had assigned me, but for my own voice and perspective. For almost 2 full years after I left North Carolina, my life in Seattle remained quiet and stable in a way that still sometimes surprised me. My photography work had grown steady enough that I no longer worried about paying rent each month. The co-working space had become a second home filled with people I genuinely enjoyed being around, and the blog I had started as a small personal project had slowly grown into something much larger than I originally expected. My days followed a rhythm that felt healthy and predictable. Mornings spent editing photos or writing. Afternoons meeting clients or working alongside other creatives. Evenings sometimes spent with Hannah or friends from the workspace. The past existed somewhere far behind me, like a chapter of my life that had finally closed. That illusion ended one gray morning when I walked out of my apartment building and immediately noticed a car parked across the street that hadn't been there the night before. Seattle streets were always full of vehicles, so at first it didn't seem strange. What caught my attention was a man sitting inside it. He wasn't using his phone or reading anything. He was simply sitting in the driver's seat of a plain rental sedan, looking directly toward the entrance of my building. The moment I stepped onto the sidewalk, his head turned slightly and our eyes met. The look wasn't casual curiosity. It was the look of someone who had been waiting. For a few seconds, we both stayed exactly where we were. I felt a strange tightening in my chest, the kind of instinctive awareness that something about the situation wasn't right. Finally, the man opened the car door and stepped out. He was probably in his late 40s, dressed in a neutral jacket and jeans that made him look deliberately forgettable. He approached slowly, raising one hand in a gesture meant to appear friendly. He introduced himself calmly and explained that he was a private investigator. Hearing those words immediately brought a wave of cold realization. I hadn't told anyone in my family where I moved, and I had spent 2 years carefully removing my online presence to avoid being located. The fact that someone found me anyway meant that whoever hired him had been willing to spend serious time and money searching. The investigator confirmed exactly what I already suspected. He had been hired by my family. According to him, they had been trying to locate me for months without success until my blog posts eventually provided enough clues about the city I was living in. From there, public records and professional listings had slowly narrowed the search until my name finally appeared connected to my apartment lease and freelance work. I listened to him explain all of this while standing on the sidewalk, feeling a mixture of disbelief and frustration building inside me. After 2 years of complete silence, the past had suddenly shown up outside my front door. The investigator handed me a small envelope containing contact information and said my family wanted me to reach out as soon as possible because there had been a serious medical emergency. After he left, I stood there for several minutes staring at the paper in my hand before going back upstairs. Later that day, the messages started arriving. They came through email first, since my phone number had changed years earlier. The subject lines were urgent and emotional, each one explaining that my father had suffered a serious stroke. According to the messages, he was in unstable condition and had apparently been asking about me. The tone of the email suggested that the family desperately wanted me to come home so that we could reconcile while there was still time. Reading those words stirred up emotions I hadn't expected. For a brief moment, I felt the old instinctive pull of obligation that had shaped most of my childhood. But that feeling quickly faded when I remembered the night at the reunion and everything that came before it. Instead of replying, I closed the messages and tried to continue my day, but the contact didn't stop. A few days later, my sister Madison somehow managed to reach me directly. I still don't know exactly how she got my new number, but she called late in the evening while I was working on photo edits. When I answered and heard her voice for the first time in 2 years, the moment felt surreal. Madison sounded emotional in a way I had rarely heard from her before. She spoke quickly, explaining that the family had been worried sick since I disappeared, and that my father's condition had made everything even more urgent. She begged me to come back, saying that everyone wanted to make things right, and that the family needed to be together during such a difficult time. While she talked, I listened carefully, but something about the entire conversation felt slightly off. The words sounded rehearsed, almost like someone trying to follow a script about reconciliation rather than speaking naturally. That feeling grew stronger over the next week when official-looking documents started arriving at my apartment. They were legal notices connected to the Caldwell Family Trust, discussing potential changes to inheritance structures and company leadership arrangements in light of my father's medical condition. The language was formal and complicated, but the general message was easy enough to understand. My father's illness had created uncertainty about the future of the family company, and suddenly the family seemed very interested in locating the son they had ignored for years. The final confirmation came when Brandon showed up in person. One afternoon, there was a sharp knock on my apartment door. When I opened it and saw him standing in the hallway, dressed in an expensive coat and wearing the same confident expression I had known my entire life, the past felt like it had physically stepped into my home. Brandon walked inside without waiting to be invited and looked around my apartment with thinly disguised judgment, as if evaluating how far I had fallen since leaving the family behind. The conversation that followed was tense from the beginning. He spoke about the company, about the complicated situation our father's illness had created, and about how the family needed to present a united front during uncertain times. The entire speech sounded less like concern and more like a business discussion disguised as family concern. At one point, I told him calmly that I had no intention of returning. Brandon reacted exactly the way he always had whenever I disagreed with him. His tone turned dismissive and slightly mocking, like he was dealing with a younger sibling who was being unreasonable. He said I was being dramatic again, just like always. Then he laughed lightly and made the same familiar comment he had made countless times when we were younger, telling me that I had always been too sensitive about everything. Hearing those words again after 2 years of distance felt like stepping directly back into a role I had spent my entire life trying to escape. Without saying anything else, I stepped forward and closed the door directly in his face. As the lock clicked into place, the silence inside my apartment returned. But this time the quiet carried a very clear realization. My family had not tracked me down because they suddenly understood the damage they had caused. They had tracked me down because my father was ill, the future of the company was uncertain, and the missing son they once laughed about had unexpectedly become relevant to their plans again. After I closed the door on Brandon, I stood in the hallway of my apartment for a long time without moving. The entire encounter had stirred up emotions I thought I had already buried during the 2 years I spent rebuilding my life in Seattle. Hearing his voice again, seeing the same arrogant confidence in his expression, and listening to him dismiss my choices the way he always had brought back a familiar frustration that I hadn't felt in a long time. But underneath that frustration was something else now, something I hadn't possessed when I left my family behind. Distance had changed the way I looked at things. When I originally walked away from the reunion in North Carolina, my only goal was escape. I wanted space from the constant comparisons, the jokes, and the quiet humiliation that had followed me throughout my entire childhood. Leaving meant freedom, but it also meant I stopped paying attention to anything connected to my family, including the business that had always defined their identity. Now, suddenly, that business was reaching back into my life again. Over the next several days, I started noticing how often Brandon had mentioned the company during his visit. At the time, his words sounded like the usual family pressure, but once I replayed the conversation in my mind, the pattern became clearer. He had spoken about deadlines, investors, and leadership challenges far more than he talked about our father's health or the supposed desire for reconciliation. That observation was what pushed me to start looking deeper. Instead of responding to any of the messages my family continued sending, I opened my laptop and began researching Caldwell Fabrication Group the same way any outsider might investigate a large company. Because the business worked with public contracts and industrial manufacturing clients, a surprising amount of information was available through industry reports, financial disclosures, and local business publications. At first, the articles looked normal enough, mostly describing the company's long history of successful contracts and steady growth over the years. My father had spent decades building the company into one of the largest fabrication suppliers in the region, and his reputation in the industry had always been extremely strong. But the more recent reports painted a very different picture. In the months following my father's stroke, several deadlines connected to major manufacturing contracts had been missed. A few industry analysts had begun questioning whether the leadership transition inside the company was stable enough to maintain their existing relationships with investors and suppliers. There were even hints that some longtime partners were quietly reconsidering future deals. Those kinds of signals may have looked small to an outside observer, but I had grown up around enough business conversations to understand what they meant. The company was struggling. That realization was strange for me because I had spent most of my life believing Caldwell Fabrication Group was practically indestructible. My father had always spoken about the company like it was a legacy that would outlive all of us. Brandon was supposed to be the perfect successor who would carry that legacy forward without difficulty. But the information I was reading suggested something very different. Brandon's leadership wasn't going well. Over the next week, my curiosity turned into something closer to investigation. I started digging through corporate records, shareholder filings, and industry databases that listed executive changes and financial performance indicators. It felt oddly familiar, like the kind of research project I used to complete in school when I was trying to prove something to myself. During that process, I remembered the legal documents that had been delivered to my apartment earlier. They were still sitting unopened on my kitchen table, where I had left them after my initial frustration. One evening, I finally decided to go through them carefully. Most of the language was complicated legal terminology related to the Caldwell Family Trust, but certain sections stood out once I slowed down and read them line by line. One detail in particular caught my attention. Despite the way I had been treated throughout my life, I was still officially listed as a beneficiary of the trust structure connected to the company. The documents outlined several contingency scenarios involving ownership shares and decision authority if certain family members became unable to perform their roles. My name appeared in those sections more than once. The realization hit me slowly but powerfully. Legally speaking, I still had standing in matters connected to the company. I sat at the kitchen table staring at those pages for a long time while the meaning settled in. For most of my life, I had been treated like the extra child, the accidental addition, who wasn't really part of the future my parents envisioned. But on paper, within the legal framework that actually controlled the company's ownership, I was still part of the structure. For the first time since leaving home, I felt something shift in the balance of power between me and my family. I wasn't just the embarrassed kid from the reunion anymore. If the company was truly facing instability, my presence could suddenly matter in ways my family never expected. The next step required help from people who understood the corporate world better than I did. Through contacts I had made in Seattle's co-working community, I reached out to a lawyer who specialized in corporate governance and trust law. He wasn't someone connected to my family, which made the situation much easier to discuss openly. Over several meetings, I explained the structure of my family's company and showed him the documents that had been sent to me. His reaction was calm but noticeably interested as he examined the details. According to him, the trust structure my father had created years earlier gave each listed beneficiary certain rights to information and involvement if the company entered a period of leadership uncertainty. With my father incapacitated and questions emerging about Brandon's ability to manage operations, those clauses suddenly carried much more weight. In simple terms, I had more influence than my family probably realized. At the same time, I also contacted an old business acquaintance from my college years who now worked in industrial supply consulting. Through him, I gained access to additional industry reports and internal rumors circulating among contractors who had previously worked with Caldwell Fabrication Group. Those reports confirmed what the public articles had only hinted at. Deadlines were slipping more frequently. Investor confidence was weakening. Several major contracts were under review because clients were worried about leadership stability. As I gathered that information piece by piece, a clear picture started forming in my mind. My family wasn't desperately searching for me because they suddenly regretted how they had treated me. They were searching because the company my father built was entering a fragile moment, and the legal structure surrounding that company still included the son they once laughed about in front of 50 relatives. For the first time in my life, I wasn't standing outside the family system feeling powerless. If I decided to return now, I wouldn't be walking back into that world as a quiet afterthought who tried to avoid causing problems. I would be walking in as someone the company might actually need. The decision to return to Ohio was not emotional, and it certainly wasn't sudden. By the time I finally booked a flight, weeks had passed since Brandon showed up at my apartment in Seattle. During that time, I had gathered more information about Caldwell Fabrication Group than I had ever known even while growing up around the company. I understood the financial pressure the business was facing, the instability created by my father's stroke, and the growing concerns among investors who were beginning to question whether Brandon was capable of leading the company through a difficult period. Before agreeing to come back, I made one condition very clear to the lawyer who had been advising me. If my family wanted me involved in any discussions about the company, I wanted full transparency regarding its finances, contracts, and internal reports. I was no longer interested in vague conversations about family unity or emotional appeals about coming home. If they wanted me there, they would have to treat me like someone with legitimate standing in the company's future. To my surprise, they agreed. The flight back to Ohio felt strangely calm compared to the night I had driven away from the reunion 2 years earlier. Back then, I had left in the middle of the night with no destination in mind, and nothing but a small travel bag in my passenger seat. Now I was returning with a clear understanding of the situation waiting for me, and a plan that had been forming quietly in the background for weeks. When I arrived, the first place I went was a hospital where my father had been recovering since a stroke. Walking into that building felt surreal. Hospitals always have the same quiet tension in the air, the soft echo of footsteps in hallways, the constant background of medical equipment, and the low voices of people speaking carefully as if the walls themselves demanded respect. I checked in at the front desk and was directed toward a private room on one of the upper floors. When I stepped inside, the sight of my father was the first moment during that entire trip that truly affected me emotionally. He looked smaller than I remembered. My father had always carried himself with a certain physical presence, the kind of confident posture that came from decades of running a successful company and commanding the attention of everyone in the room. Now he was lying in a hospital bed surrounded by quiet machines, his body noticeably thinner, his movements slow and careful. His eyes moved toward the door when I entered, and for a few seconds we simply looked at each other without speaking. I could see the recognition in his expression immediately, followed by something that looked like relief. He tried to sit up slightly when he realized I was actually there, but the movement seemed to exhaust him. The conversation that followed was awkward and uneven. His speech was slower than it used to be, the result of the stroke affecting certain parts of his coordination. He told me he was glad I came and that he had been hoping to see me. There were pauses in his sentences where it felt like he was searching for the right words, but those words never quite arrived. At one point, he said he knew things had not always been easy in our family. He said he regretted certain things. But the apology I had imagined hearing during the long drive away from the reunion 2 years earlier never actually came. Instead, there were fragments of regret, vague acknowledgments that mistakes had been made, and long stretches of silence where both of us seemed to understand the weight of everything that had happened without directly saying it. I stayed for about 30 minutes before leaving the hospital. The visit gave me something I needed, but it wasn't closure in the way people often imagine. It was simply confirmation that time had moved forward and that my father, the man who once dominated every room he entered, was now a weakened figure whose control over the family empire had quietly slipped away. The next morning, I went to the Caldwell Fabrication Group headquarters. The building looked exactly the same as it had when I was younger. The large glass entrance, the company logo mounted above the lobby, and the busy rhythm of employees moving between offices all carried the familiar atmosphere of a place built on decades of routine. But once I started walking through the departments and observing the daily operations, the cracks beneath that surface became much easier to see. Over the next several days, I kept a low profile while paying close attention to how things were actually functioning inside the company. Employees were tense in ways that didn't exist when my father was running the business. Conversations in hallways stopped abruptly when certain managers approached. Several department heads seemed frustrated during internal meetings where deadlines and production targets were discussed. It became obvious that communication between teams had started breaking down. Brandon's leadership style was the most visible source of those problems. He treated employees with a level of impatience that bordered on hostility, dismissing suggestions during meetings and interrupting people before they finished speaking. Instead of adapting to changing industry trends, he pushed the same strategies the company had relied on for years without acknowledging that the market had evolved significantly. One example became especially clear during a marketing discussion with several department heads. While competitors were investing heavily in digital branding, online client acquisition, and modern corporate messaging, Caldwell Fabrication Group was still relying primarily on traditional networking and legacy relationships built decades earlier. Brandon dismissed the idea of modernizing the company's branding strategy almost immediately, calling it unnecessary and expensive. Watching those conversations unfold made something very clear. The company wasn't failing because the industry had suddenly changed. It was struggling because the leadership guiding it refused to adapt. During those days, I began having quiet conversations with several board members and senior managers who had worked with my father for many years. Instead of criticizing Brandon directly, I presented something more constructive. I proposed creating a new internal division focused entirely on digital branding, strategic partnerships, and modern corporate positioning. The plan involved building stronger online visibility for the company, attracting younger investors, and expanding client outreach beyond the traditional industrial network the company had relied on for decades. Because of my background in photography, creative work, and digital media communities, I was able to explain those strategies in practical detail, rather than vague marketing language. I showed them research about competitor companies already moving in that direction and outlined realistic timelines for implementing similar systems inside Caldwell Fabrication Group. To my surprise, the board members listened very carefully. Several of them asked thoughtful questions about the cost structure and expected growth projections. Others requested copies of the research I compiled during my time in Seattle. Their reactions made it clear that they were not only open to new ideas, but actively searching for someone capable of stabilizing the company during an uncertain period. Brandon, however, reacted exactly the way I expected. When he heard about the conversations I had been having with board members, he laughed openly and dismissed the entire concept during a meeting, referring to me as the artsy brother who suddenly thought he understood business because he ran a blog and took pictures for a living. His reaction didn't bother me nearly as much as it would have 2 years earlier. While Brandon was busy mocking the idea, I was quietly documenting the decisions he made, the investor concerns being raised behind closed doors, and the growing list of operational mistakes that were starting to affect the company's stability. The difference between us was simple. Brandon believed I had returned as the same younger brother he had always been able to dismiss. In reality, I had returned with a plan and with the patience to build support from the very people who were becoming increasingly desperate for competent leadership. The board meeting that changed everything took place several weeks after I returned to Ohio. By that point, I had spent enough time inside Caldwell Fabrication Group to fully understand the depth of the problems the company was facing. Investor confidence was slipping. Several long-term contracts had been placed under review, and the internal atmosphere among employees had become increasingly tense. What had once been a stable organization built on decades of reputation now felt like a company slowly losing its direction. During those weeks, I had also been quietly preparing. Every conversation with department heads, every report about delayed projects, every investor concern that reached the board had been carefully documented. I had gathered internal financial data, records of missed deadlines, and multiple formal complaints from employees who had reported Brandon's management style as disruptive and hostile. None of that information had been gathered in anger. It was simply the reality of how the company had been operating since my father's stroke. The board meeting itself was scheduled as a closed session involving the core leadership group responsible for major strategic decisions. When I walked into the conference room that morning, the atmosphere was noticeably serious. The long wooden table that had hosted countless executive meetings over the years was surrounded by board members who had known my father for decades. Several of them had watched me grow up, although in those years I had rarely been considered relevant to the business. Brandon was already seated near the center of the table, leaning back with the same relaxed confidence he always displayed in meetings. He barely acknowledged me when I entered, offering a small smirk that suggested he still viewed the entire situation as a temporary distraction rather than a serious challenge to his authority. The meeting began with routine updates about production schedules and current contracts, but quickly moved toward the main topic that had brought everyone together. One of the senior board members addressed the room directly and explained that the company needed a clear long-term strategy to stabilize operations during my father's continued recovery. That was when I was asked to present the proposal I had been developing. I stood up and connected my laptop to the large screen mounted on the wall behind the conference table. The presentation I had prepared was detailed, structured, and supported by weeks of research into both the company's internal problems and the broader changes happening across the manufacturing industry. I began by outlining the current challenges facing Caldwell Fabrication Group. I explained how the industry was shifting toward companies that combine traditional manufacturing expertise with modern digital strategy, branding, and investor communication. Competitors were strengthening their market positions by adopting technologies and outreach strategies that our company had largely ignored. Then I presented the proposal itself. The plan involved restructuring the leadership framework of the company to create a dedicated modernization division responsible for digital branding, strategic partnerships, and long-term growth planning. Instead of relying solely on legacy relationships and outdated marketing approaches, this new division would focus on expanding the company's reach into emerging markets and strengthening investor confidence through transparent communication and modern corporate positioning. At the center of that plan was a new role that did not previously exist within the company: Director of Strategic Operations. The position would oversee modernization efforts across departments, coordinate communication between leadership teams, and ensure that the company adapted to evolving industry expectations rather than resisting them. Once I finished explaining the structure of the proposal, I moved to the second part of the presentation. This was the section that changed the tone of the room. I displayed documented evidence showing how the company had been operating under Brandon's leadership during the months following my father's stroke. There were financial reports highlighting declining investor confidence, internal memos regarding missed contract deadlines, and summaries of employee complaints describing management decisions that had damaged morale across several departments. None of the information was exaggerated. Every document came directly from internal records or formal reports submitted to the board. As the evidence appeared on the screen, the atmosphere in the room shifted from polite attention to something much heavier. Several board members leaned forward in their chairs while reviewing the information, occasionally exchanging quiet looks with each other as the pattern became impossible to ignore. Brandon attempted to interrupt at one point, dismissing the documents as exaggerated interpretations of normal operational challenges. His voice carried the same dismissive tone he had used during every conversation we had since my return. But this time the room did not respond the way he expected. The board members had already spent months dealing with frustrated investors and anxious department heads. Seeing the full collection of evidence laid out in a structured presentation simply confirmed what many of them had already suspected. When I finished speaking, the room was quiet for several seconds. Then one of the senior board members asked a simple question about my willingness to personally lead the modernization division if the proposal were approved. I answered calmly, explaining that I was prepared to take responsibility for implementing the strategy and stabilizing the company's operations moving forward. The board requested a short private discussion. Brandon and I were asked to step outside the conference room while the members voted. The hallway outside the room felt strangely calm compared to the tension inside. Brandon paced slowly back and forth, clearly irritated by the direction the meeting had taken. He muttered several complaints about how the board was overreacting to routine setbacks and how my presentation had been designed to embarrass him. I said nothing. Several minutes later, the door opened, and we were called back inside. The board had reached a decision. The vote was unanimous. The proposal to restructure the company's leadership framework was approved, and the new position of Director of Strategic Operations was formally established with me appointed to the role immediately. As part of that restructuring, Brandon was removed from executive control and reassigned away from operational leadership responsibilities. The moment was not dramatic in the way people often imagine corporate power shifts. There was no shouting or confrontation. The board members simply explained their decision in calm, professional language based on the evidence presented and the long-term stability of the company. Brandon sat silently as the announcement was made, his expression shifting from disbelief to anger as the reality of the situation settled in. For me, the moment felt strangely quiet. I wasn't thinking about revenge or victory. I was thinking about the responsibility that now sat directly in front of me. Over the next several months, that responsibility became my full focus. The modernization division was built from the ground up, bringing together younger professionals with experience in digital strategy, brand development, and investor relations. Communication between departments improved as leadership meetings became more collaborative instead of hierarchical. Employee morale slowly recovered once people realized that their concerns were finally being taken seriously. Investors who had begun questioning the company's stability gradually regained confidence as new contracts were secured and deadlines were consistently met again. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but the direction of the company steadily improved. Eventually, my father left the hospital and entered a quiet retirement, stepping away from daily involvement in the business he had spent most of his life building. Our conversations remained limited, but during one visit he acknowledged something in a quiet voice that carried more weight than any formal apology ever could. He admitted that I had succeeded where Brandon had failed. Hearing those words did not erase the past or the years of feeling like the unwanted child in my own family, but it marked a moment I never expected to experience. For the first time in my life, I was no longer the family mistake people laughed about during gatherings. I was the person who stepped in when everything was falling apart and rebuilt a legacy that everyone else had nearly destroyed.